So it is wonderful to see everyone here today, some beloved faces that were able to join us today. It's just a real treat. And we hope that this whole event will be wonderful for everyone. It's another celebration of our 50th anniversary as the Downtown United Presbyterian Church. And I have a wonderful panel of folks who are going to talk about the merger, but anything else that they think is important or fun or any. I just gave them free reign, so hopefully we won't have to edit this for content because it's too adult. That's good to say at a church, isn't it? Yeah, I'm glad I made that joke. Let me just set up a couple of the ground rules, if you will. I was debating how to handle questions, and I think in order that everyone has an equal opportunity to speak, I'm going to have each person speak for around 5 minutes. And if you would hold your questions till after that, even though I know that's hard sometimes, it will allow us to get everyone to have their say, and then we'll open it up for questions afterward. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, all right. Let me introduce our panel members, although they need no introduction, as they say. And I'll just ask them each where they came from theologically and from a church, and how many years they have been with us. And then we'll get started. So.
Well, I've all, is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. I have been a Presbyterian all my life. I was born into it. My father was a Presbyterian minister, but I've been a member of this church since 1966. That is the predecessor brick church and the new merged church.
Thank you. Just pass.
I'm Karen Holtz. I was started coming here when I was 2 years old. So I've been here at Brick Church. And so I've been coming here 63 years. So
Which is weird.
yeah, right. 30.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm Mary Bookout. I joined Central Presbyterian Church in 1955. So I've been a member that long. And I'd been going to Central since I was, I think, in kindergarten. So throw in about 7 more years.
Everybody here. Okay, is there a way to?
Don, can you turn it up more?
No, but other people could not. So we could, yep, and it'll go higher.
All right. I'm Sam King, and I was brought up in this church, so I guess I would have to go back to 1954. And of course, when we joined our church as a family. And of course, I went through confirmation here at the old brick church.
Like Ed, I'm another Presbyterian PK. I was brought up in the church. We joined Central Church as a family when we came to Rochester, and we joined Central in May of 63. So that's what, 51 years. So been here forever.
I'm Bill Mackey. I followed Joan into Central Church in 1957. So we've been there a bit.
I'm Joan Mackey, and I was raised a Presbyterian and came to Rochester in 1953, joined Central Church in 1954. So it's been 70 years from the time I joined till now.
I'm Carol Samuel, but I came to Central Church as Carol Olson, and I married Gene Carter, so I was Carol Carter, and then he passed away, but then I
married Jean Samuel, who they were both members of BRIC, but I had my Central Presbyterian. We were married the day, Jean Samuel and I were married the day before the merger.
Okay, and I have someone who volunteered to go first, often a tough position, but it would be well handled by someone who was moderator of the Presbyterian here for years and years and years. So we'll start off with Bill Mackey.
Still finishing his lunch. Pardon me. Memories did not come easily to me, so I tended to rely on documentation. That's the clerk in me. But John Holzclaw wrote actually a 60-page document on his life at Central Church, within which he spoke of the downtown church and the process. And I thought it might be helpful to have some sense of the context within which the merger took place. The 1950s represented the high point in church attendance, worship. And as the 50s waned, going into the 60s, so did membership and attendance. So there was that. But that was part of a much larger societal change. The 60s was the anti-war, civil rights, urban renewal, moving from here to the suburbs. So the whole environment was change. On top of that, long-term pastors also changed. Murray Cayley, I think, was the one who was close to 40 years at First Church, and he retired. Arthur Adams left to go to Philadelphia. David McLennan from Church moved to another church. So early in the 60s, all the churches changed their pastorate. So in addition to the change in society, we were all stuck with more changes. And so change was the order of the day. There was no intentional, there was no intent to merge the churches. I think actually probably the first, the thing that I could read about anyway, in 1966, the presbytery asked the 3 Presbyterian churches, do you really want to stay downtown? You folks are moving to the suburbs. Do you want to stay downtown? The three Presbyterian churches said, yes, we do. Now, those 3 churches, are within sight of one another, as is St. Luke's. And St. Luke's probably was as forthright or forthcoming as anyone in suggesting collaborative services or actions. In fact, at one point, Dr. Winnie of St. Luke's proposed to both Central Church and BRIC at different times, the hiring of an additional clergy person to work part-time helping him at St. Luke's, but also working half-time on mission projects that we might engage together. So we're beginning to talk about things that we might do together. But the process was slow, very sporadic. There were very few joint efforts, but there was a feeling that we probably ought to be doing something different. When David Romig was called to the BRIC Church, he came with the history of having left a merged church, and he had gone through the process of how that merger happened. So he kind of crystallized the need for establishing goals for the churches. And through that, we set up the goal-setting process and hired a person to bring us through it. Leonard Steitch arranged for the various advocacies to come. And each of the 4 churches, the 3 Presbyterian churches and St. Luke's, appointed or asked for volunteers for 4 members plus the clergy from each church. Four members and 4 alternates. I was an alternate, but I did attend the meetings. So we heard 30 different advocacies and then voted on which wins we wanted to engage in and what goals we wanted to adopt. There were 18 goals. Can you believe it? Yeah, very few got the enthusiasm of the resources to move them forward. 3 were really demanded of us by the coordinator. We would have worship, pretty obviously, leadership, and communication. And I think by communication, he meant more than just a newsletter, but a real careful description of what our message was and to whom it was to be given. So communication was critical. So that's the background. I'm not sure, we could go on, but who else wants to add to what the process was or what their memories are?
You want me?
Go in any order that you want to.
Okay.
I was gonna go left to right, but
Oh.
maybe you just want to figure it out and go along, or shall I be more structured? Okay, we'll start. Yeah, I'm already.
Get this over with, Kim.
Let's get it. So we'll go that way.
Isn't she a good master of ceremonies? I think we should thank also the committee that has been working on the 50th anniversary. This is wonderful. Bill has given you some of the context that led to the 4 churches working together, which ultimately led closer.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That ultimately led to the merger. But I think there is another context, or I would like to add to the context that that even got us motivated to move. Think of the 60s. 1960 began with the first president who was Catholic. And that we were also in the midst of the Cold War. And I was one of those generations that got called up as a result of Kennedy's having to show force against that background. The 60s also brought the assassination of that president. This is terribly upsetting for those of us who lived through the quiet 50s. And the 50s were sort of a recovery from a massive war that was a result of economic decisions that were made after the war to end all wars, the First World War. And as I recite this, think of the role of the church through this history. In my lifetime, some 80, closer to 90 than 80, if you backed up from my birth date to the year 1852, that would be one lifetime equivalent to my life today. 1852, we were in the midst of a conflict in our own society, not unlike the one we're facing today. And the church played a significant role in that. Now, back to the 60s. The environment for the church at that time was one of searching and a lot of questioning. We were living through a time that we had not met before, and we didn't seem to be terribly well prepared for it. Angela Davis, a prominent Black philosopher, the church as a denomination was supporting her, and yet members were having lots of problems with that. And we lost members as a result of that. The changes that took place in the 50s with the opening of the school system and the rise of the voices of the oppressed part of our society and the leadership of Martin Luther King. And these were all things that churches had not really confronted before. This is all new territory. So when we got to the point where the Vietnam War became very prominent in our conversations, not unlike some of the conversations we're having today. We had another president who said, "I will not run again." The church involvement at this point, I'd like to just sort of describe what my experience was. I had lived in Manhattan and my church was Riverside. And the ushers wore frock coats or morning coats. That was not new to that. When I lived in Plainfield, the Presbyterian church there had morning coats and a boutonniere. You knew who the usher was, and you were ushered to your seat. This was not the church that was going to confront real problems. So this was the atmosphere that I think these churches were beginning to look at. We were losing membership. We thought maybe because we were downtown. 3 Presbyterian churches within 2 blocks of each other didn't make a lot of sense. And so when David Romig came, there was quite a shift in the person that was being called from our previous pastor, where the emphasis had been on great sermons and I also think great music. Some of the people here, parents, were in that choir, and so remember that change as well. So now we're up to David Romig having been called, and I think the congregation was beginning to see that changes need to be made. I recall I was asked to be on the nominating committee and was the chair. And at that time, the conversation was no women were served in official positions of the church. And I managed to get Joan Wolfarth's name before the congregation, and she was our first elder. And I think we all know the history of Joan Wolfarth. Has made significant contributions to the denomination as a whole. So that was the context in which David Romig, in conversation with David McMillan and Jim Franz at first, and I forgot who the rector was at St. Luke's, but all 4 of those finally decided that we had similar problems. Let's go to work on them.
I was in 9th grade with the merger, so my memories are of a teenager. I was the first confirmation class of the downtown church. My confirmation certificate has 7 pastors' names squeezed onto it. My church school years and junior high, high school were spent going between 4 different buildings on Sunday morning. Our church schools were different places each week. There was a bus that took us around. Our parents never knew where we were on Sunday mornings. But part of that also, I got to learn about the Episcopal faith, having St. Luke's part of that. But it was fun. It was just a really fun time. As we were merging, you have 3 whole buildings you have to deal with. My mom, Joan Wolfarth, somehow got involved with the huge auction that we had, getting rid of stuff from 3 buildings. So I helped out with that. I love history, and I loved going from attic to basement in each building, looking to find what we were going to sell. And it was so much fun. And there were some really odd things that we found. First church, we found a mounted deer head. I don't know what use they had for that. Central Church was the time when we had the Shakespeare Theater was working out of there. They had just gone bankrupt. So when I went into their offices to see what was left, it was really eerie, like they had just gone out for lunch and everything was still there. And that was just really bizarre. What we also found in Central were the original pewter communion plates and cups that were used, which you'll see in a display case back behind the sanctuary. That's some of them that we found. Brick Church's oddity was a Civil War rifle that we found down in the safe in the basement, which turned out, and you've probably never really looked at it carefully, as you come out the sanctuary to go up the stairs, there's a big white marble plaque on the wall. That's a memorial to all the Civil War dead in Brick Church. And that rifle used to lay on the bottom of it. And how many churches are old enough that you have a Civil War memorial? Some of the additional items, and we had this auction out of the gym downstairs that also went into the parking lot because we had so much stuff. We had 7 grand pianos we had to get rid of, upright pianos, numerous silver tea sets. I've never seen so many silver tea sets, and more chairs than you could count. I mean, it was just an incredible, and then hearing the auctioneer, I've never been to an auction. That was a lot of fun. And we managed to get rid of almost everything. Just some of my other remembrances were having to choose each Sunday which service to go to, Celebration 1 or Celebration 2. I liked the casualness of Celebration 2. I always loved the music in Celebration 1, so I was really torn. So mostly it was up to who was preaching that day and who did I like. So I would go there. Again, as a teenager, we had a group called the Youth Task Force, or YTF. It was a ministry towards some of the kids that were downtown or from troubled families. So I got to know people that are teens that were totally different from my suburban background, which was really nice. And I was sort of on the fringes of YTF, but I did meet some really nice kids. My mom was very, very involved. She ended up being the first clerk of session of the merged church. I remember her always being on the phone and always at church meetings. And she said right after we merged, our official name was First Central Brick until we chose a name. So I remember sitting up in the balcony waiting for that. We all got to vote on what our name should be. And I always thought Downtown Church was the boring choice, but and she also mentioned to me, she said the first session meeting had 50 elders at it. So
I'm Mary Bookout. I'm going to stand up because I'm always hard to hear, and that might make it a little easier to hear me. And I so appreciate everything that you told because it leads well into what I want to say. I think a lot of people have done a much more diligent job than I have on, on the whole process. And we've just heard about that bus named Abraham that went around on a constant loop, I think, of the 4 churches. We were having worship in 4 places. We were having Sunday school all over the map. As you said, nobody knew quite where their kids were. And at the same time, it was hard to leave any of those buildings. And I think that the people who were going to all the grown-up evening meetings were trying to figure out how we could find the catalyst that would make that move. So I'm going to tell you a story about just one day in January, and I'm pretty sure it's 1972, but somebody can fact check me on that. The Lake Avenue Church, Baptist Church, had just had a huge fire. We all heard about it. It had been in the paper. It had been on the radio. It had been on television. And I had a good friend who sang in the choir there. It was terrible. But we didn't really think it had anything to do with us. And then I got a phone call from David McMillan, minister at Central, who said that there'd just been a joint session meeting, or maybe a central session meeting, I'm not sure. And they decided that the following Sunday, we would have cleared ourselves out of the building at Central well enough so that Lake Avenue could move in, have their Sunday school, have worship, have their choir, and live there as long as they needed to. I was teaching kindergarten, and could I be sure that between now, Tuesday afternoon and Sunday morning, we moved the kindergarten, leaving nothing behind, taking nothing with us that we could leave behind, because Lake Avenue had been gutted. They lost everything. So I called a bunch of parents, and Saturday morning we went down to make the move, and appreciated greatly the curate from St. Luke's and his family, who came down, and instead of helping us in the kindergarten, and all the other rooms were packing too, just went up to the kitchen and made a steady supply of chocolate chip cookies, which everybody would understand are the best possible fuel for this kind of situation. Joyce Button was co-teaching with me, and so we were kind of leading the operation. And we were taking seriously that business of, you need to move fast and don't take anything you can leave behind. We didn't count on the children. And we had our own children, which, because some people were parked with us because their parents were upstairs moving an office or moving the choir or something, met quite a few. And they gave us a lesson in fairness and thoroughness. One long block for Lake Avenue and one long block for us. One red crayon for Lake Avenue and one red crayon for us. Piece by little, piece by little, piece by little piece, we made 2 piles of every single thing in the room. And meanwhile, we're on our hands and knees scrubbing paint off the floor, washing the windows, realizing, just the way you would if somebody moved into your house, that every time we moved something, there was dirt behind it. We did not have a moving truck. We were not moving just a few boxes of things. And so luckily, somebody had a van. Somebody had a station wagon. And we took, it was a snowy day, tables and chairs and a large red rocking horse with springs, which didn't go very well into a station wagon. And all those crayons and all those things. And when we got over here, discovered that exciting back elevator, which I still find a little bit scary, the way you can see through it. And if you're very good, you hit the button exactly the right place to reach the floor. And otherwise you go, boop, 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 trying to get sort of close because you're pushing things out. Because we were assigned, sorry, I still have a chip on my shoulder about this. We were assigned to put the kindergarten on the 3rd floor of Allen Street, which does not have an elevator. And we had to schlep all that stuff up. But that day I learned a lot. I learned a lot about children sharing in a very love your neighbor as yourself in a very fair way. I learned a lot about being welcomed. I learned a lot about how you do keep finding more dirt behind and under things. And we left the room as clean as we could get it with chocolate chip cookies instead of the usual pretzels, because we felt that if you've just had a fire, you also needed quick energy. And came over here to read a little picture book called Sad Day, Glad Day, because every moving day is like that. But suddenly we had let go of a building that many of us were very attached to. And we're, as I said that morning, sitting on the floor, we're here because they didn't have a place to go. And our friends at Brick said there's room for all of us here. And there's always been room for all of us here.
Wow, that's fascinating stuff. Anyway, I mentioned that I was a member of Brick Church, of course, throughout the 50s and in Sunday school, and lots of happy memories from that, and also during my teen years. But in 1965, when I graduated from high school and went to college, I became pretty much I was on a long sabbatical from coming to the church. And I think that probably rings true with many of you. After your family, or after you went to college or graduate school, you weren't very active in church. And that was the case with me. So during the late 60s, it happened that my mother was on the PNC at Brick Church to call David Romig. So that was a wonderful experience. And of course, whoops, that was my alarm here. She was very loyal to Brick and to David over the years. So when I came back on vacation times, at Christmas and so on, I would come to church, but I knew nothing really of what went on during the actual negotiation of the mergers. So that from 1965, actually through the time that I went to, was in school in New York City, and I was in a Vista volunteer after college for a couple of years. I was not active here except when I went to church with my mother occasionally, Easter services and a Sunday here or there. But at any rate, so I missed all the committee work and so on, and really didn't become active until after my mother died, and I would say, recruited heavily by my previous director of Christian education, who was at Brick Church for decades, Jean McDougall Brigham. And of course, she worked closely with my mother when my mother did Katie's House, who some of you have heard about, that was sponsored by the church. At any rate, Jean thought very much as a mother to me, and after I was married to Diane, pretty much recruited us to come to the church. We both came back. She was a Methodist, but in Pittsburgh, but she became a Presbyterian with me. And of course, when we had our children, we brought Baird here, and that was a big thing for him and Jean over the years. She was like a substitute grandmother to a large extent. And actually, at that point, when I became back here, I was really recruited by David Romig to be involved as a trustee. And so I became a trustee and then eventually became treasurer. So that was my history and involvement in the church and I wasn't really real active during the time of the working out of the merger with the remaining United Presbyterian Church.
Dave McDowell, I think everybody knows me. I've been noisy around the place. We came in May of 1963. We arrived in Rochester in 1957. Went out to Parkminster for a while because the minister there was a friend of Dad's. But then commuting from Penfield to Gates was just too much. And I had gotten to know a number of the folks at Central through work and so on. And so we started going to Central. Fran, we had 2 children at that point. Fran got heavily involved in the Sunday school and the nursery and a group called Mother's Club that was a women's group of women who had young children. Our 5 children, as they came along, got involved, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. No surprise to anybody, I immediately got involved in sound and the broadcasting and in the building facilities. That we don't remember that we had a property committee then, but there were a group of us that performed the same function that the property committee does today. Mary's already mentioned the Lake Avenue Baptist fire. I was on session when that happened. And that happened, Mary, you were very close on a Saturday, January 15th. And we had a session meeting, coincidentally, I think on the Tuesday. And the general feeling of the session was, as Mary pointed out, let's make our building available to Lake Avenue Baptist, and they ought to have it as long as they need it. And a session, we sort of struggled, well, what are we going to do for worship and Sunday school and so on? And we said, well, let's tell Brick we're going to come and worship with them. And somebody said, well, don't we have to get their permission? And I guess it was Dave McMillan said, if we want to come worship, they'll welcome us. And so what we did is, of course, there was no internet or email in those days. We sent letters out to everybody in the congregation, typical snail mail. But we also agreed that we would post a member of session at each door of the church and escort people over to Brick. And of course, we warned Brick that we were coming, and the ministers talked and the sessions talked. But we basically walked on Brick. And to me, that was one of the key points in the whole merger, because that was the instigation that said, we're starting at least a merged activity right now. The other thing people haven't mentioned is Brick, Central, First, and St. Luke's were the 4 churches in what was known as the 100-acre tract. Now, the 100-acre tract is what was Rochesterville. That was the beginning of Rochester, and those were the 4 churches that were within the 100-acre tract. Just a few comments about sound and churches and broadcasting that I always find amusing. At Brick here, they had let me start with Central. Central had a little room underneath the stairs in the front of the sanctuary. Have you ever noticed on either side of the Central Sanctuary when you've been to Augustine thing or something, that there are stairs that go up to the balcony? Underneath the one on the left side, there's a little room where we had a amplifier and a tape recorder. And that's where the sound engineer was. And he played microphone roulette. You had a worship bulletin, but you were never quite sure who was going to speak from where. So you turned up all the microphones a little bit, listened, and when you saw where somebody was, that was the mic you turned up. And so very shortly after I got here, I got involved in playing microphone roulette. When we came over to Brick, after when we started it was after that we walked on Brick, and we were in a 4-church activity in that time period. There was really kind of the formal arrangement that had been referred to here a couple of times, where we were doing things as 4 separate churches, but trying to merge activities. Well, once we got here at Brick, I realized that Brick was broadcasting. The rest of us have been recording services and making them available, but Brick was broadcasting. And they had one of the ushers that had a little box on a back of a pew, clear back in the back north west corner of the sanctuary. And he tried to adjust the sound from there for in-house. But the radio people didn't want to use our mics. So they came in and every week put a second set of microphones in the lectern and the pulpit and the center floor and things like that. And they had an engineer out in the red carpet area, again, playing microphone roulette with a program. And so depending on how astute they were, the two, the in-house and the broadcast matched, otherwise they didn't. A couple of us said, gee, this is foolish. And so I can't remember who we went to, session or trustees or somebody, or maybe just the ministers, and got permission to build a sound booth. So that sound booth you see back up in the top corner of the church was built by Dick Elwell, who was our maintenance man at that time, and a couple of us to centralize all of the equipment. And at that point, we put in a good enough sound mixer that the radio station was willing to use our pickup and feed to the radio station. And we had a soundboard built by a local sound outfit. But the fun story for me is that we had to run wires. Again, we were trying to keep costs low, run wires from the front of the sanctuary for all the mics up to that sound booth, and then back down to behind the organ loft to the amplifiers. And so I recruited a couple of folks and all of my kids. My kids all learned the basement of this building, pulling wires for our sound system, many of which we're still using. By the way, I want to mention that Don Fairman arrived in 1971, joined Central, and it didn't take very long for us to get him involved in the sound. And he's been involved with the sound since. I guess that's enough.
I've got another one here.
There, that better? Good. I'm just going to read a few notes. Leaving one church for another is always a complicated business, no matter what the reason. I'd been a member of Central Church for 20 years before the merger with First and Brick Churches and was very happy there. Although in full accord with the merging of the three churches, underneath it was always the question, how will three churches manage to assimilate three different cultures with three different clergy approaches? Those working on the merger did all they could to help those giving up their buildings feel more at home at Brick Church. Many symbolic pieces from each of the other churches were brought to the worship space, new to so many. The communion table with the words "in remembrance of me" was brought from Central for the sanctuary. And of course, we use it every Sunday. The stained glass pilgrim window from Central graces our Taylor Chapel. And when we have baptisms in the sanctuary, we use the old stone memorial font from the First Church. Also from the First Church is the Hondo Christ, a Japanese silk tapestry, which now hangs in the balcony above the angel windows. Only those from Brick Church know how they felt with so many new people descending upon them. It could not have been easy. In his poem, 1974 to 1975, David Roman points out why merging three churches was challenging in other ways. He wrote this poem has 19 verses. I'll read just one. The joint parish council got testy, for it hung on 3 sessions of vestry, 2 boards of trustees, and in lesser degrees, 12 committees 9 groups, and a presby. As always happens with big changes in churches, some people leave, and that happened in the 70s. Those who stayed remained steadfast, and good things happened. With hard work and people willing to make adjustments, the rough places became smoother. Getting to know new people was a blessing, and having old friends from Central for support added stability. With new members joining after the merger, we began to think less and less about who came from what churches. It was a good beginning, and who knew that we would be talking about those days 50 years later.
Shame on me for not being so organized. I got my notes. Yeah, I came to Rochester in 1959 to go to nursing school. And I worked at Rochester General for a long time, 48 years after I graduated. So I came walking down Main Street with 4 of my classmates, and our handbook said First Presbyterian and it said Brick Presbyterian. It didn't say Central, but there was Central staring us in the face. So we went there, and that's the beginning of my story. I joined the choir because Ken Donmoyer, then the musical director there, cornered me. We had a downtowners. That's something that is dreadfully missing in today's society, is the young adult groups. It's really sad. They had retreats. That's where I met my first husband, who was clerk of session here at Brick Church. And we were married in 1970, sadly for only a year and a half. Dave McMillan, I saw him again this spring, and he knows exactly how I feel. Without him, I would not be even who I am today. That was a horrible loss. Gene took his own life. And then I married Gene Samuel, and he was Sunday school superintendent, and Gene Brigham was director of Christian Ed. So again, lots of common connections here. So we were married on January 14th of January 12th of 1974, and the next day was the first service here. The other thing that we had first was the first child born to merged church parents, who was born in June of 1975. So part of the merger, there were a lot of groups that worked on a lot of business parts of merging the church. But they came to the decision that we needed one more thing, and that was the Pastoral Care Committee. And with that, I met a couple of really wonderful people. Louise Campbell, your grandmother. I couldn't believe it. I was like young, and this lady was going on a trip to the Caribbean, and she was buying a new swimsuit, and she was like 65 or 70 years old. I was like, wow. Well, I travel like that now. So we had parishes within the merged church, and it was all divided up with sort of with locales of where you lived. So we were part of a group. The other blessed thing is that we got invited to join the new couples club, the NU couples club, which had been going on since Arthur Adams said we need these groups. Our little group is really diminished, but we're still the new couples club. I did become an elder here. I only served that term once. That's not my bag. I've been a deacon for two terms. I'm on my last year of the second term, and I'll have to wait off, but I love being a deacon, so I will definitely do that. A couple of other things. The organ that we love so much here. I can't remember exactly what year it came in, but my husband was on the organ search committee, and we had this wonderful trip to go to Boston to see the Fisk Organ Company and to see Fisk organs in some of the historical places. That was a great thing. I got to go along. we had some wonderful events, social events here at the church. And one that I really remember very well is our Mardi Gras. Yes, Mardi Gras. And I still have the crown at my house. Yes, and David Romig was the king and I was the queen of the Mardi Gras. There are all these groups, but we had a wonderful dinner and little tiny plastic babies were inside of each of the king cakes. And so somebody got that's a prize that you're supposed to bring in the king cake, the next thing. The other thing that I had, I'd written down Jean Brigham's name because she was like a grandmother to our daughter. Our parents were all way out of town, and Jean Brigham, when Sarah was little, she was 3 months old, we were up at the Cape and right next door to Jean Brigham's, and she said, well, I wonder what she should call me. She said, maybe she can call me grandma. And I said, oh, she said, no. She's got two grandmas. I'm going to be Aunt Jean. So it was Aunt Jean and Uncle Harlow, a precious, precious connection. When we had a little rift where I wasn't worshiping here, and when Jean Brigham died, I came back to sit in her seat. And you know, the sanctuary had a lot of people in it then. It wouldn't be the same now. But thinking back to Central days, Arthur Adams was the senior minister. We had Dana Fearon, who ended up marrying Arthur's daughter. And they had, and then Dane Gordon was the other associate minister. And one time I was at the Cape and I went to visit this Presbyterian church, and there's Dana Fearon doing a summer gig at that Presbyterian church. So I got to see Dana again. It's been a wonderful ride. I'm not involved as deeply as many of you are into all the nitty gritty, but I like to see what keeps going for our church. I really do.
This one's better. Okay. Thank you so much to this incredible group. We couldn't have orchestrated it better. I mean, everyone just had so much to contribute, different angles, all sorts of things. A quick note, I'm also one of the 50-year members, and I had probably a longer hiatus than you, Sam. I think it was about 30 years. But I grew up in the church. Jean Brigham was my Sunday school teacher, and then your mom, and then later when she married Harlow, he took recorder lessons from my dad, and we're great friends. So many wonderful people. And Karen, you were much better and you were going to Sunday school. I think I was a year older. I remember riding the elevator, see what's going on in the apartments on the 4th floor with Janet Praisel. And then, but anyways, we also did some good things. We would love to take questions that you have for anyone or in general, and I'll pop over to you with the microphone. Somebody get the ball rolling for us with a beautiful question or an okay question. Oh, I see one here, and then I'll get you, Mary.
I'm curious, when the church that burned down came to Central, how long did they stay, and did you ever have worship at Central again after that, or did you completely stop?
When Central went,
It's on, it's working.
yeah, okay. That was the last time that the congregation of Central met at Central, except for 1 or 2 special events. But
Wow.
that was, up until that time, there were committee meetings in process and let's do this, let's do that. But that instance made the merger, really.
Wow. Switch to this one.
I was just curious, those 18 proposals, Are there any of them that there are still remnants around that we followed through on? I was asking Ed maybe.
Well, there were a number of, well, there are 18. There was a advocacy for a ministry for older people, which turns out to be very, very necessary. Rather, kind of forward-looking, there was an advocacy for a ministry to technocrats. Technology was growing along with other stuff, and people perceive that, things are different and people are going to be reacting differently. So that was one of them. But of course, worship, there are many options, youth, a whole bunch. But of all those possibilities, I can't think of any that were really implemented with resources.
I think one of the things that came out of that early advocacy was broadcasting from all of the churches involved during the activity process. And in fact, what we did was, although First did not have any sound equipment internally, so their services were becoming minimal, but we did broadcast on a rotating basis from St. Luke's and Central and Brick here, of course. And in fact, Dawn and I helped St. Luke's get rewired and set up for broadcast. And a team of us would rotate around for about 2 years to all 3 of the churches, and we would alternate the broadcast from those churches.
Yeah, I was wondering why St. Luke's ultimately dropped out of the 4.
Because the denominational kinds of differences were in the way. How do you merge an Episcopal church and 2 Presbyterian churches or 3 Presbyterian churches? They seem to pull away. I was not involved in those committees. Bill may remember better than I do. But I think it was really liturgical and church procedural things that said it's just, you can't make it work.
Yeah, I could confirm what Dave said. Bruce Hansen, who was the minister there, worked with us. His kids were in my Sunday school, but when it came down to the real merger, there were still Episcopalians, and there are enough substantial differences. One of the things that happened to me kind of is that my dad had grown up Episcopalian and was very involved in all of this process. And so they wound up at St. Luke's, and Dad became not an elder at Central, but warden of the vestry at St. Luke's.
So I don't know how long Lake Avenue Baptist was at Central, but I do know that in 1974, they were at a church that was on Plymouth Avenue, down right near where 490 goes through. And I know that because I was a member of Lake Avenue Baptist in 74.
That would be First Church, I think. I wondered if I don't remember them using First Church, but maybe they did. I can't remember what happened.
More questions? Anybody?
Everybody remembers that Hochstein, one of the things we did when the churches merged is we gave Hochstein the central building for $1. And I think it was $100,000 we gave him to fix the roof. And we also sold, quote unquote, First Church to Franklin Fornes' church. I can't believe it.
Central Church of Christ.
Central Church of Christ. And that is still there and still a viable church. That's the church just on Plymouth Avenue near 490 with the purple doors. And so, what?
Across from the police.
Yeah, across from the police station. So we determined that the facilities we had as a merged church would not be sold off to developers or something like that, but would be given or sold to groups that were either churches or heavily involved in community activities that would make use of the church. And I think that's true of both Hochstein and Central Church of Christ. So that was a real mission activity.
I have two things. I didn't know the Lake Avenue connection. I don't think, maybe I did somewhere in my head. But when the car ran into the side of their building a couple years ago during the pandemic, I had my friend, Rebecca, Presbyterian from Third Church, was working there with the youth, and I immediately said to Nancy, hey, we should inquire if they need to use our building. They're welcome to. They didn't end up doing that, but we did send them a letter saying they were. So that was kind of cool to learn today for me. And my other question is the history of being on the radio. I remember when I was growing up that it was on live, and then there was this, and then, so was it first live and then it was recorded? But I wondered, what was the history of that? Like, was it live always? When did that start?
Rick was live and the merged church was live, even though we were rotating around buildings. And we continued live until the costs of being on the air were too prohibitive. Initially, Don, initially the churches were given airtime, but then it cut back, and then for a while we were on delay recorded. We arranged so that if we recorded it and took the tapes to the radio station, they would put it on for us at a later time when there wasn't they couldn't get the money for the airtime.
Okay.
And so we did that for a while. And then eventually even that became difficult and troublesome. We went through about 3 different stations. In fact, I'm sure John remembers, as I do, chasing tapes out to radio stations so that they could get them on the air. We then, for a while, were actually able to transmit it electronically to the station, but then we just gave up entirely.
Okay.
And then, of course, with the COVID thing, we resurrected all of that and are now doing it live streaming.
Great. We have a question back here. I just wanted to say I loved the radio broadcast. When I would stay home from church sick or convinced my parents, I would listen to the radio broadcast, and both my parents in the choir, and I could always hear my dad clearing his throat. I knew that, and I was like, oh, there's Dad.
I was just going to make a statement that back whenever right after the merger, so when it was communion time, that the Presbyterian Church, us, had communion, you on the air had to be 1 hour. You didn't have extra time for communion. So we would broadcast on that first Sunday of each month out of St. Luke's. And then it would rotate back to our church for the other 3 Sundays. And just because of that 1 hour limit, and that was when it was live and you couldn't fudge the time. Now, I was going to make another comment about the sale to Hochstein, because the initial sale was not a sale. It was a 50-year lease. And back to David say, the church's concern was whether the persons or company, whatever businesses, would make sure they did something constructive with the building. And so they had a 50-year lease. And then after Hochstein, when was it, 3 or 4 years ago, or whatever, did a $4 million investment. They put the air conditioning and updated all of their facilities. Then our session says, oh, they must be serious about being solvent. And then they actually got the ownership of the church then. I just thought that was a slight tidbit.
Thank you, Don. We have time for a couple more. I always leave them wanting more, right? Although we could do this for quite a while and.
I think it's important also to realize that the merger was not the original intent of the four churches' goal setting. We were all facing somewhat the same problem. And how do we become faithful in the age in which we live? How do we stay faithful in the age in which we live? And this was the kind of the way of getting at that, the goal setting. As we got into it, that began to, the talk of merger began to surface, and it became more of a focus, I think. I'd be interested in whether the other panelists had somewhat the same issue. I don't think, at least as I remember it, that merger was the significant objective.
Thank you.
Is separate.
Is that good?
A little.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that, in terms of all the difficulties of merger, and a question came up, how did you deal with all of the clergy? Well, I don't know how that was decided, but not only was there three senior Presbyterian pastors and a rector from St. Luke's, 2 associate Presbyterians, and then we hired an additional person to deal with all the justice concerns, another person for Christian ed. So at the time of the merger, we had 7 ordained pastors, all installed, and the Book of Order, which is the Bible of Presbyterianism, did not have co-pastor. What to do? So there were associates in ministry for a number of years until the Book of Order got changed to accommodate co-pastors. But that concept of co-pastor also pervaded this church. And not only were there co-pastors, each of them was equal to one another, but had various responsibilities. But also the staff, in part, was on a co-basis. It seems to me that we had co-financial secretaries at one point. But anyway, that was one of the new things that the downtown church gave to organized religion.
Very interesting.
And that co-pastorate lasted through the 90s, really.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, Marilyn.
As with the clergy, merging together and the churches, how did the choirs do this? Was the choir huge? And did all the directors take turns?
Any
Relying again on John Holsclaw's work, John was very much involved in the worship task force, which was dealing with music, which was not easy because the brick church was, I believe, entirely paid or virtually entirely paid. The first church may have had some paid, but very little. Central had 4 lead singers, and that was it, to lead each section. So there were lots of concerns there, and who was to be the leader? It was agreed that Milford Fargo, who has the longest experience and excellent reputation, he was the choir leader at Brick, and that he would be the leader of the combined church. As that discussion was going on, Third Church was talking about a contemporary worship, and Milford Fargo said, I'd like to be involved in that. So Milford decided that he would not stay at the downtown church. He'd go to Third to do this contemporary thing. So the church started a long-term or a search process, and Mel Butler was found. Yeah.
Yeah, have to just say one thing about that. It doesn't shed great light on my dad, but we all loved him. My mom was the soloist for years, the mezzo soprano. And when Mel came, I guess there were a couple people and that sang the same as my mom, and he gave solos to the other person and kind of overlooked my mom. Dad went to third pres to follow Milford for about 2 months, and then he came back and you can, yeah, it was crazy. TMI, perhaps.
So I understood the whole like catalyst with the like merger almost like between Central and Brick. Was there like a certain first in Brick? Or first, which one was like which one was it that hosted the church that had the fire? That was Central. So at that same time so Central came here to
Yeah.
Brick.
Yeah.
Was there a certain time that created that first would then merge in? Was it the same time or was there a certain event that then caused them to merge as well?
I'm not sure. That kind of was organic. That the first was the smallest of the three churches. And so when Central and Brick essentially merged by themselves,
Informal.
informally, right, but practically. And so eventually, as the process continued, and Presbytery probably got involved, and eventually, First became a part of the process. But I'm vague on the specifics.
I know that we could do this all day. It's fascinating, but I know people have to move on to the rest of their day. Maybe we could end with, not to put you on the spot as I put you on the spot, but maybe each of you could share, or maybe one word or a sentence or a thought or something that has been meaningful to you over all these years. And then after we do that, and thank you, I wonder, put you on the spot, Pastor Phil, if you would lead us in a benediction. Okay, great. And I can just, you don't have to go in order. Does anybody want to start with a word or a thought or a quick? Yeah.
Today, we are a merged church. We are the Downtown United Presbyterian Church. And quite frankly, for many of us, even those who came from the other churches, we've forgotten much of the other churches, their memories, but today we're the Downtown United Presbyterian Church.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dave. Anyone else?
I guess I have learned the meaning of community. That, it was part of the lectionary or part of the dictionary, but it had no real meaning until I experienced it.
You.
I'd like to read something from Reinhold Niebuhr that I think speaks to me anyway, of all the efforts that we have put in through the years with all the ups and downs, the happy times and the sad times. And it goes like this: nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in a lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we are saved by love.
Thank you, John. That's beautiful.
I would just say that out of all of our history here, we should hold dearly to the future.
Anybody else? I'm not going to force anybody. Anybody? No. Ed?
Oh, Mary and then Ed.
Getting ready to do this, I was going through old family pictures and I found this from 1974. And was looking at pictures in it of small children who are now grandparents, and talked to one of them. And she said, be sure to tell them it was the best community to grow up in.
Well, I think about the goal setting. My memory goes back to one of the goals which involved the physical environment. And it began by thinking about our neighborhood, but it resulted in my moving downtown with my long time friend, Sam and Jenny Davidson. And it's only been recently that like 6 or 8 months ago that I moved from there. That's 50 years ago. I think it began a process for us that has become part of our culture to be relevant to the age in which we live. And our search now is much the same as it was when we entered into the goal setting process. We're living in a context that has a lot of similarities to the age of the 60s and all that created the 60s. And I think the question that we all are asking ourselves is not only our church, but the greater church. How is it meeting the challenges of today?
Thank you. Thank you, Ed. We have a big round of applause for our wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Pastor Phil.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say thank you to the presenters for sharing that history with us, and especially with me. As you know, I'm new here. But no, seriously, thank you. It's good, good to hear your reflections on what happened and how these churches came together. Now, I said during worship that I'm going to be away next Sunday, and that I was going to leave you in the capable hands of Carl De La Fave. And, at some point, I'll give you the history of how Carl and I come to know one another. He's Presbyterian, we've been working in these vineyards. But Carl is going to do the benediction and send us out of here.
Let's knit our hearts together in prayer. God of our fathers and God of our futures, we come together as individuals, but as a community to celebrate our past, our present, and to go into the future with you. This is a place of brick and mortar built by human hands, yet held together and powered by love. God's love for us, our love for God, and our love for each other. May it always be so. Amen.